Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission, as always, is to grapple with these really foundational texts, these big philosophical arguments, pull out the key insights, and, well, lay them out for you with as much clarity as we can manage.
And today, we're tackling something huge. We're tracing this really unexpected connection.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. Between the, you might say, rigid world of Immanuel Kant in the 18th century.
Right, Mr. Enlightenment rationalism himself.
And the, well, much more apparently chaotic, passionate, deeply personal philosophy of 20th century existentialism. Think anxiety, freedom, despair.
It does seem like an odd pairing at first glance, like finding, I don't know, the blueprints for a sleek modern skyscraper tucked away inside some ancient castle ruins.
Exactly. Most people think Kant is sort of the polar opposite of someone like Sartre, right? Kant's all about universal reason, duty.
And Sartre prioritizes radical subjectivity, freedom, this idea that there's no external meaning imposed on us.
But we're aiming to go deeper today.
That's the plan. Our mission in this deep dive is really to show how Kant, maybe unintentionally, laid a lot of the groundwork, how he acts as a forerunner to these core existential concepts.
We're talking human finitude, that feeling of being limited.
The terrifying weight of freedom, the burden of it.
And also the structure of moral responsibility, how we actually choose who we are.
It's all there, just maybe hidden under layers of dense philosophical argument.
And the sources we dug into, they're dense. It's deep philosophical analysis, focusing really closely on Kant's big critiques, his ethical framework.
And what they reveal, I think, is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it shows how much of what we now call modern anxiety or the existential crisis was kind of already bubbling up in Kant's own project.
Especially in his attempt to, well, to save morality from the scientific worldview of his time.
It's incredible, really, a philosopher obsessed with universal duty. And yet he provides the scaffolding for radical individual choice.
It's a fascinating tension.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think the most logical place to start, especially for anything existential, is right at the beginning. The fundamental limits of just being human. #tag1, human subjectivity, and the limits of knowledge. Finitude.
Right. So we have to start with Kant's most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason. Came out first in 1781.
A big one.
The really big one. And this text is legendary for basically drawing the line, setting these strict limits on what human reason can actually know. Kant called this our inherent limitation, our finitude, Endlichkeit in German.
So if we want to understand the later existentialist idea, that we're just sort of thrown into a world without any pre-given meaning, we first have to see how Kant kind of dismantled the old external supports.
Yeah.
The metaphysical guarantees.
Precisely. You've hit it exactly. Before Kant, you had centuries of traditional metaphysics aiming for something.
Yeah.
Well, almost like a God's eye view of reality.
Trying to know things as they really are, independent of us, that kind of thing.
Yes, things in themselves. That's the philosophical term. Trying to grasp existence from the perspective of some infinite, all-knowing being.
Which sounds ambitious.
Very ambitious. And Kant's big move, his critical turn, especially in the part called the Transcendental Analytic, is basically him saying, hold on, we can't do that.
We just can't access that divine viewpoint.
We can't. We're finite beings, not divine ones. Our knowledge is always shaped by our own built-in structures, our senses, our categories of understanding. We only know the world as it appears to us through our human lens.
So no access to the view from eternity.
None whatsoever. Subspecie eternitatis, that's off the table. And this realization, this inability to step outside our own minds, that's maybe the first big existential shockwave Kant sends out.
And because we can't rely on that external objective viewpoint anymore, the focus has to shift inward, right, to our own subjective experience.
Exactly. If those external metaphysical proofs are unreachable, what's left? Only the internal landscape, the subjective experience of being a self.
Which sounds very existentialist already.
It really does. This is why Kant insists, just like the existentialists would centuries later, that the first-person perspective is absolutely central. Our existence, our world, is defined by self-referentiality.
What does that mean exactly, self-referentiality?
It means consciousness always involves a reference back to the self. For Kant, the famous line is that the I think must be able to accompany all my representations. Every thought, every perception is tagged as mine.
Okay, so we're kind of stuck inside our own heads, structured by our own way of thinking.
We are. We're thrown into this situation where the only truly secure point isn't some external truth, but the necessary structure of our own consciousness. There's just no escape from subjectivity.
So if we can't theoretically prove God exists, or that the soul is immortal, or grasp the ultimate nature of reality,
Then the meaning of our existence, if there is one, has to be found within us, within the human subject, through our choices and actions.
that's the crucial link then. Kant's focus on finitude, on the boundaries of what we can know.
It creates the perfect soil for existentialism to grow in later. It's no accident that someone like Sartre would later say the core of his philosophy is that humanity cannot pass beyond human subjectivity.
Kant drew those boundaries.
He drew them definitively. If you can't prove God's existence theoretically, if you can't know the ultimate metaphysical truths, well, then the responsibility shifts entirely onto us. We have to create meaning right here, right now, through what we do. The cosmic safety net is just gone.
So the critique of pure reason isn't just about what we can know. It's fundamentally about what we can't know. It's like clearing the ground.
Exactly. It argues powerfully against any theoretical proofs for God or the soul or other metaphysical concepts. These things, Kant says, are contingent matters. We can't know them a priori just through reason alone before experience.
They're beyond our pay grade, basically.
In terms of theoretical reason, yes, it's a radical critique of that kind of speculation. And by limiting knowledge to the realm of possible experience, Kant completely shifts the focus. It's not about what we can know anymore, but about what we must do.
And that act of restriction, that's the key precursor.
I'd argue it's perhaps the single most important philosophical move paving the way for existentialism. It creates the space where the absence of metaphysical certainty forces us into a state of, well, absolute freedom and inescapable choice. The main job of philosophy is no longer just contemplation, it becomes action.
Okay, this is where it gets really, really interesting for me. Because Kant wasn't trying to push people into despair, was he? His big goal was actually to save morality.
That's absolutely right. He saw a huge threat coming from the science of his day.
Newtonian physics, right. The idea of the universe as this giant clockwork mechanism, all cause and effect.
Exactly. If everything in the physical world, including our brains and bodies, is just following deterministic laws, then where does human freedom fit in? Are our choices just illusions?
And if they are illusions, then how can we be morally responsible for anything we do?
That's the core tension, the central philosophical antinomy, as Kant saw it. How do you reconcile scientific determinism, the idea that we're part of nature, subject to its causal laws, with our undeniable inner experience of being moral agents who must choose, who feel we ought to act certain ways?
It seems like an impossible bind.
It did. And Kant's solution is incredibly clever and hugely influential. He basically says we need to look at ourselves from two different perspectives.
Like wearing two different pairs of glasses?
Kind of. He introduces this crucial distinction between two different kinds of causality.
Okay.
First, there's the causality of nature. This is the scientific view. Every event is determined by prior events according to necessary empirical laws, like billiard balls hitting each other.
Standard cause and effect.
Right. But then, he says, there's also the causality of freedom. This is something unique to rational beings like us. It's the power to spontaneously start a new chain of causes, independent of that deterministic natural chain.
To initiate something new, out of nowhere almost.
Not exactly out of nowhere, but initiated by reason, not just pushed by prior physical causes. It's the power of agency, the ability to make a choice that isn't simply the inevitable results of everything that came before it.
Okay, so how does this play out? When do we experience ourselves under one causality versus the other?
Well, think about how you view yourself sometimes, from the third-person perspective, like looking at yourself from the outside.
Analyzing myself, maybe? My personality, my history?
Exactly. When you do that, you tend to see yourself as, well, a product. You see your empirical character, shaped by biology, upbringing, past experiences, habits. From that viewpoint, you look determined, predictable even, unfree.
Yeah, I can see that. Of course I acted that way, given my background.
Right. But then imagine you're facing a real moral choice, a tough decision. Should I lie to protect myself or tell the truth and face the consequences?
Okay.
In that moment of decision, that third-person analytical perspective kind of collapses, doesn't it? You're forced into the first-person perspective.
The perspective of the person actually making the choice.
Exactly, the perspective of the agent. And when you're deliberating, trying to decide what you ought to do, you have to assume you can choose. You have to presuppose that you could actually initiate either action.
If I didn't believe I could choose, the whole process of deliberation would be pointless. A sham.
Precisely. So freedom, for Kant, isn't some theoretical thing we might discover out there in the world. It's a necessary practical postulate. It's something we must assume to even make sense of our own moral experience, of the act of choosing itself.
Wow. So we can be both things at once. Determined natural beings when viewed scientifically.
As empirical phenomena, yes.
And yet, simultaneously, free moral agents when we act and choose.
As rational agents, capable of initiating new causal chains through reason,
Yes.
the conflict dissolves if you recognize that these two viewpoints operate in different conceptual realms, you might say.
One is how we appear to external observation. The other is how we experience ourselves as agents.
That's a good way to put it. And the beauty of it for Kant is how this connects directly to the moral law itself.
How so?
He argues we don't know we're free through some kind of special intuition or feeling. We know it because we are aware of the moral law, the categorical imperative within us. That feeling of, I ought to do this, or I ought not to do that.
Okay.
That feeling of ought, Kant famously says, logically implies can. If morality tells me I ought to do something, it must mean I can do it. Otherwise, the ought makes no sense.
So freedom is the necessary condition for morality even to be possible.
Exactly. It's not proven by science, but it's proven in a practical sense by the reality of our moral awareness. It cements freedom as this inescapable feature of our human existence as rational beings. #Tag3, the incorporation thesis and moral choice. And this way of resolving the freedom determinism problem, this idea that freedom is presupposed by the moral law. Well, that leads us straight into the mechanics of how we choose. And this is where Kant introduces what scholars call the incorporation thesis.
Okay, the incorporation thesis. And this is really the bridge connecting Kant's ethics to that later existential idea of radical choice.
I think it absolutely is. It provides the structural underpinning. But first, we really need to get clear on Kant's terminology about the will, because it can be confusing. He talks about Willkür and will.
Right. Let's break those down. What's the difference?
It's a crucial distinction. Will, W-I-L-L-E, refers to the legislative aspect of our will. It's practical reason itself. Think of it as the source of the moral law, the categorical imperative.
So will is the rational part, the part that understands universal moral principles,
Yeah.
the lawmaker.
Exactly. It's inherently rational, universal, it generates the ought. In a way, will isn't free in the sense of arbitrary choice. It's free only in the sense that it's determined by reason itself, not by desires or external forces.
Okay, so that's will. What about Willkür? K-U-R at the end.
Willkür is the executive function. It's the power of choice, the capacity we have to actually act on principles or rules, which Kant calls maxims.
So Willkür is the part that decides which rule to follow in a specific situation.
Precisely. Willkür stands at this crossroads. On one side, you have will, practical reason, telling you the moral law. On the other side, you have your sensuous nature, your inclinations, desires, fears, impulses.
And Willkür has to choose which one to listen to.
Or rather, which incentive to incorporate into its rule for action, and its freedom lies in its spontaneous ability to make that choice.
Okay, so Willkür is the decider. And this is where the incorporation thesis comes in.
Yes. The incorporation thesis basically states this. Freedom, the freedom exercised by Willkür, is the act of taking up an incentive, whether that incentive comes from reason, dewey, or from inclination, desire, and consciously adopting it into a general rule, a maxim for your action.
And can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you feel an impulse, an inclination, like hunger. That feeling itself doesn't automatically cause you to eat, not in the way a reflex works.
Right. I can choose to ignore it or postpone eating.
Exactly. Your Willkür has to freely adopt a maxim, like, whenever I feel this particular sensation of hunger, I will incorporate the incentive to eat into my plan and seek food. Or maybe you adopt the maxim, even though I feel hungry, I will finish this important task first, incorporating the incentive of duty over inclination.
Okay, I see. So the choice is about which incentive gets written into the rule I decide to follow.
That's the core of it. We aren't just puppets pulled by strings of desire. We are agents who legislate for ourselves by choosing which incentives become the basis of our actions through these maxims.
This sounds hugely important for moral responsibility. It means we're not just responsible for what we do, but for the underlying rules we build our character on.
Absolutely. That's the profound implication. We aren't held responsible, Kant argues, for simply having inclinations. You can't help feeling tired or attracted to something or hungry. That's just part of being human, part of our facticity, as an existentialist might say.
Our given nature.
Right. But we are totally responsible for the act of prioritizing those inclinations, for choosing to elevate a desire over a duty, or vice versa, by incorporating it into our personal law, our maxim. This act of incorporation shapes our fundamental moral disposition, our gesinum.
So every choice of maxim is like laying another brick in the structure of the self we are building.
That's a great way to put it. It is the ultimate existential claim, really.
Yep.
We choose ourselves, moment by moment. And Kant grounds this self-creation in the idea of moral autonomy, the will giving itself the law based on reason.
But you mentioned earlier that this idea of autonomy, self-legislation, actually creates a kind of dilemma, one that points towards existentialism.
Yes, there's a deep tension here that many philosophers have pointed out, and it really does foreshadow later existential worries about the grounding of morality.
Okay, let's try to break down the two horns of this dilemma. What's the first problem, the self-determination issue?
Well, for morality to be truly autonomous, the rules have to be genuinely self-imposed by our rational will, the will. If the rules came from anywhere else, God, society, even our natural feelings, then it wouldn't be autonomy, it would be heteronomy. We'd be constrained by something external.
Okay, that makes sense. Morality has to come from within our own reason.
But here's the tricky part. If the will creates the moral law through its own act of legislation, where does the law get its binding authority before that act? If the rules are purely self-created, how can Kant still claim they are universally valid and necessary for all rational beings? It seems like they need some authority prior to the choice to adopt them.
I see. If it's just my reason making it up, why should your reason make up the same law? Where does the universality come from?
Exactly. And if you can't solve that, you risk falling onto the second horn of the dilemma, the contingent fact problem.
Which sounds a lot like Sartre's idea of radical choice.
It sounds strikingly similar. If the actual content of morality, the rules themselves, are somehow created ex nihilo out of nothing simply by an act of choice, a decision by willkür,
then morality just becomes arbitrary.
it collapses into sheer volitionalism. It becomes, it's good because I choose it, rather than I choose it because it's good, because reason shows it's good. If I just decide to follow the moral law as one option among many, without any prior rational necessity compelling me, then the law loses its special status. Its universal, necessary grounding disappears.
So that sounds exactly like Sartre saying existence precedes essence, that our choices literally create our values.
It's very close. Kant desperately wanted the moral law to be grounded in reason, to be necessary and universal. But his emphasis on the freedom of willkür, the need for the individual agent to actively choose to incorporate that law into their maxim, creates this inherent tension. The pull between the necessity of the law and the absolute freedom required to adopt it. That's the tightrope walk that leads directly into existential anxiety. Tag 4. Inescapable freedom, radical evil, and self-deception.
Right. And the moment you truly grasp that your freedom is absolute, that you must choose your fundamental principles, well, anxiety seems like a natural response.
It does. And the sources we looked at show Kant clearly anticipating the specific kind of existential dread, what Kierkegaard would later famously call angst. He was writing about it decades earlier.
How did Kant make the distinction between just regular fear and this deeper moral anxiety?
For Kant, it was a crucial difference. Ordinary fear, he thought, usually has a specific object. You fear a known danger, getting sick, losing your job, a physical threat. There's a determinate thing you're afraid of. Anxiety, or angst, on the other hand, is different. It's more like a fear or dread concerning an undetermined ill. The threat isn't a specific object out there. It's something vague, unsettling, stemming from the sheer possibility inherent in your own freedom.
The danger is me, my potential to choose wrongly.
Exactly. It's the dread that arises when you confront the boundless possibilities of your freedom and the potential for failure or self-betrayal that comes with it. A failure you can't even fully define beforehand because it relates to the very constitution of who you are choosing to be.
And this is the feeling that kind of hangs in the air before someone makes a fundamentally bad choice, before the fall into evil, as Kant puts it.
That's how he describes it. This anxiety precedes the fall. And remember, for Kant, this fall isn't some historical event like Adam and Eve. It's a choice each individual can make.
What is that choice exactly? How does the fall happen?
He describes it as the individual, maybe overwhelmed by the demands of reason or the anxiety of choice, choosing to bind themselves primarily to their sensuous nature. They decide to prioritize self-love, inclination, comfort, or personal advantage over the moral law.
They essentially choose the easier path, turning away from the difficult demands of virtue.
Yes. They turn away from service to virtue, and this inevitably leads, Kant says, to inner conflict, despair, even self-hatred. Because on some level, the rational part of the self, will, knows that the choosing part, Willkür, is prioritizing the wrong thing. It knows it's violating its own rational nature.
Okay, and this leads us to Kant's famous and often misunderstood doctrine of radical evil. We should stress again, this isn't about inherited sin.
Absolutely not. It's entirely individualistic. Radical evil isn't just about doing bad things occasionally. It's a deeper corruption of the person's fundamental moral character, their basic orientation, the Gesinnung.
So it's not an action, but a state or a disposition.
It's a fundamental disposition. It's rooted in a evaluative mistake made at the deepest level of the self. The agent chooses, as their fundamental maxim, to subordinate the demands of the moral law to the incentives of self-love or inclination whenever the two conflict. It's adopting a propensity, a hang in German, towards evil.
A tendency, a leaning towards prioritizing self-interest over moral duty.
Right? But it's a freely chosen leaning.
So, if radical evil is this fundamental corruption, how does it manifest? Is it just being weak-willed? Giving in to temptation?
Kant argues it's actually much deeper and more insidious than mere weakness. The key characteristic of radical evil is self-deception.
Lying to oneself.
Yes, it's a willful act of self-handicapping. To cope with the anxiety of absolute freedom and responsibility, the agent deceives themselves. They pretend they were forced to act by their desires, their temperament, their circumstances. They try to convince themselves that the deterministic third-person view is the whole truth.
They essentially deny their own freedom to choose otherwise.
Precisely. They lie to themselves to escape the terrifying burden of their own willkür, their power of choice. They opt out of acknowledging their freedom.
Wow. Okay, the parallel to Sartre's concept of bad faith here is just unavoidable, isn't it?
It's incredibly striking. Bad faith, for Sartre, is exactly that. The act of self-deception, where you pretend to be a thing determined by your past or your role or your nature, precisely to avoid the dizzying reality of your radical freedom and responsibility.
Kant basically laid out the ethical structure of bad faith centuries earlier.
He really did. The agent in a state of radical evil actively prioritizes their sensuous self over the moral law, but they have to hide this fundamental choice from themselves. They tell themselves a story. I couldn't help it, that's just how I am. Anyone would have done the same.
They adopt the empirical, determined character as an alibi.
Exactly. And this inability or unwillingness to squarely face one's own absolute freedom, this lying to oneself about the power one possesses, that is the core mechanism of moral corruption for Kant.
And the sources suggested that once this self-deception takes root, once the Gesinnung is corrupted in this way, it's really hard to fix.
Extremely difficult, because it's not just a bad habit you can break. It's a corruption of the very foundation of moral decision-making. The choice for evil, this fundamental maxim prioritizing self-love, becomes deeply embedded in the person's character, almost like a second nature, but one they've freely chosen.
So overcoming it wouldn't be about just trying harder next time.
No, Kant believed it requires something much more drastic, a complete internal revolution. Right. Given how deep this radical evil goes, corrupting the fundamental disposition, the Gesinnung Kant realized that just trying to improve bit by bit isn't going to cut it.
You can't just patch up a rotten foundation.
Exactly. You can't climb out of that kind of chasm by taking small, incremental steps. Overcoming radical evil, Kant argued, requires a fundamental revolutionary act. It requires what he called moral conversion.
A conversion. So the individual has to perform this internal act of, completely rebuilding themselves, breaking decisively with their old, corrupted moral identity.
That's the idea. This radical conversion isn't something achieved through gradual effort alone. It starts with a decisive shift, a revolutionary change in the person's most fundamental maxim, the one that determines the priority between moral law and self-love.
A complete change of heart, essentially.
A change of heart, yes, but understood as a change in the fundamental principle of choice. Kant actually describes it in two stages. First, there's this sudden revolutionary change in one's core character, the break from the old, corrupted Gesinnung.
Okay.
But then, that initial revolution has to be followed by a lifelong, gradual process of reform. You have to constantly work to bring your actual behavior, your habits, your specific actions into line with this new, correctly ordered, fundamental maxim.
So the evil tendency, the hang, isn't instantly erased.
No, Kant is quite clear on that. It's fundamentally reduced in its power, its priority is overthrown, but the struggle continues. It requires ongoing effort. But the core reorientation, the self-constitution, happens in that moment of conversion.
That idea, a sudden revolutionary break with a past self defined by self-deception, it really does sound incredibly similar to how Sartre talks about overcoming bad faith He spoke of needing an authentic choice, almost like an act of deliverance and salvation.
The parallel is very strong. It's that moment of choosing authenticity over self-deception. For Kant, this conversion restores what he calls our original purity. Not innocence, but the inherent potential for good that lies in our rational nature and will.
But it must take incredible strength to do that.
Immense strength. Kant emphasizes the need for fortitude and courage, Muthigkeit. You need the courage to actually use your reason autonomously, to follow the moral law, even when your ingrained inclinations and the old patterns of self-deception are pulling you back. It's a constant battle.
And this is where the risk of despair comes creeping back in, isn't it? If you know the task is this huge lifelong struggle, and you look around and see that, well, being virtuous doesn't seem to guarantee happiness.
Right. You see good people suffering, bad people prospering.
You might just think, what's the point?
Yeah.
And give up. Fall back into that despair.
Precisely. And this is exactly where Kant brings in the concepts of practical faith and hope. They become essential supports for sustaining moral effort.
Okay, so how does this work? We already established that Kant demolished theoretical proofs for God in the first critique.
He did, so he can't bring God back in as a known fact. Instead, in the critique of practical reason, he argues for the practical necessity of faith, Glaub.
Practical necessity. Meaning?
Meaning, we don't believe in God and immortality because we have empirical evidence or logical proof. We adopt belief in them as a postulate, a necessary assumption, required by the demands of morality itself in order to keep morality from seeming ultimately futile.
So it's not about proving theology, it's about providing psychological and rational support for the moral agent.
Exactly. Think about it. What happens if the moral agent loses that faith and hope? What if they become convinced that their sincere efforts towards virtue will never lead to the happiness they rationally deserve, or that they'll never have enough time, immortality, to achieve moral perfection?
They risk becoming completely demoralized.
Utterly demoralized. This ties into Kant's concept of the highest good. The highest good, for Kant, is the ideal state where virtue and deserved happiness perfectly coincide.
The world as it ought to be, morally speaking.
Right. But our experience, looking at the world through the lens of natural causality, shows a disconnect. Virtue and happiness often seem unrelated, even inversely related sometimes. This creates what Kant calls an antinomy of practical reason.
A conflict within morality itself.
A conflict between the moral demand for virtue and the rational expectation that virtue should lead to happiness. If I genuinely believe this connection is impossible, that the highest good can never be realized, why should I continue the incredibly difficult struggle for virtue? The whole moral project seems irrational or pointless.
The struggle feels meaningless without some hope of ultimate success or justice.
Precisely. So, hope, grounded in practical faith in God as the guarantor of the connection between virtue and happiness, and immortality as providing the necessary time for infinite moral progress, becomes essential. It provides the necessary, let's say, political and psychological resolve.
Political in what sense?
In the sense of maintaining commitment to building a better world, an ethical commonwealth, even when progress seems slow or non-existent. Hope allows the agent to keep striving, to keep making the moral effort, despite all the empirical evidence of injustice, suffering, and failure around them. It makes pursuing the highest good a rational possibility. Hashtag Text 6, Philosophical Anthropology and Anti-Theodicy.
Okay, so we've seen how Kant grounds freedom, choice, responsibility, and even hope within the individual subject. But the sources also mention his influence extending outwards, shaping new ways of thinking about humanity as a whole. Specifically, his role in founding philosophical anthropology.
Yes, that's another really important and perhaps underappreciated aspect of his connection to later thought, including existentialism. His work, particularly the anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, takes a different look at human beings.
How so? Different from the pure reason focus of the critiques.
Exactly. The critiques focus on the universal conditions of knowledge, morality, and judgment. The anthropology looks at the human being as an embodied, empirical creature living in the world. It analyzes our character as free, rational beings, but also considers us as natural beings with temperaments, physical characteristics, and as sensuous beings with particular ways of feeling and experiencing.
And what does the pragmatic part of the title signify? What makes it pragmatic anthropology?
That's key. Pragmatic anthropology, for Kant, isn't just about describing what nature has made of us, our biology, our basic psychology. It's primarily focused on what humans make of themselves through their own free actions.
Ah, so it loops back to choice and self-creation again.
It does. It examines how we, as free agents, shape our character, our Denkungsart, our way of thinking and judging, through the choices we make, the maxims we adopt, the habits we cultivate. It's fundamentally existential in that sense. It emphasizes that our essence, our moral character, isn't fixed or given by nature, but is something we actively construct through our freedom.
So the focus is on the human being as a project, something always in the making based on their choices.
Precisely. If you think about the implications that our being is defined by what we do with our freedom, what we make of ourselves, it sounds incredibly close to that core existentialist idea of existence preceding essence.
And you mentioned it foreshadows Heidegger.
Well, some scholars see a direct line. By focusing on what humans make of themselves as free beings situated in the world, Kant's pragmatic anthropology points towards a conception of the human being not as a static substance, but as a dynamic, maybe an open situation, a relation of being, as Heidegger might put it, whose existence is constantly being determined through interaction with the world and through self-interpretation.
So it's about how we use our freedom within the specific context, the givenness of our lives.
Exactly. Freedom isn't abstract, it's always situated freedom. We operate within the constraints and possibilities of our empirical nature, our bodies, our temperaments, our social environment. The anthropological project, for Kant, is about understanding how our willkür, our power of choice, navigates and shapes these given characteristics. It's the practical application of freedom in our concrete, everyday existence.
Okay. And finally, there's Kant's influence on the philosophy of religion, specifically his rejection of traditional theodicy.
Right. This is another area where Kant makes a decisive break, grounded firmly in his critique of theoretical reason. He essentially establishes philosophy of religion as a distinct discipline, but one based on practical moral reasons, not on trying to prove religious doctrines theoretically.
And his stance on theodicy, the attempt to justify God's goodness despite all the evil and suffering in the world, flows directly from that.
Directly. A traditional theodicy tries to give a theoretical explanation for why a good God would permit moral evil, like human cruelty, and natural evil, like earthquakes or disease. It tries to reconcile God's presumed attributes with the reality of suffering.
But Kant already argued we can't have theoretical knowledge of God's nature or ultimate purposes.
Precisely. So any attempt to build a theodicy to explain God's reasons is doomed from the start. It requires us to speculate beyond the legitimate limits of human reason. We simply cannot know why things are the way they are from some supposed divine perspective.
So trying to rationalize suffering is a philosophical dead end.
For Kant, yes. It's futile metaphysical speculation. And this limitation isn't just negative, it forces a crucial shift towards a practical response to evil.
If we can't explain evil away, we have to confront it.
Exactly. Instead of wasting philosophical energy trying to understand why there is suffering, the moral imperative becomes, what are we going to do about it? How do we struggle against it?
So the focus shifts from metaphysical explanation to practical action and moral progress.
That's the core of Kant's anti-theodicy stance. We must work, using our own rational capacities and freedom, toward the uttermost of our ability to overcome evil and make moral progress in the world. We act as if progress is possible, sustained by that practical faith and hope we discussed earlier.
Don't seek explanations. Seek solutions through action.
Right. It's a profound, practical injunction. When you encounter injustice, suffering, or evil, the primary task isn't philosophical contemplation about its ultimate cause. It's moral action grounded in our own self-determining power, our willkür. We rely on ourselves and our moral commitment, not on waiting for a metaphysical reassurance that everything makes sense in some grand divine plan. The struggle itself, fueled by hope, becomes the duty. #outro.
Wow. Okay, that has been quite a journey. A really deep dive, I think, mapping this unexpected territory from Kant's strict limits on what we can know.
Which unexpectedly opened up this radical space for subjectivity.
All the way through the inescapable weight, the burden of freedom, and landing on this almost existential call for moral conversion and practical action in the face of suffering.
And the thread holding it all together, I think, really is Kant's analysis of the structure of moral choice itself, that incorporation thesis we talked about.
Right. The idea that we choose our maxims, our fundamental principles.
Yes. By placing the ultimate responsibility squarely on the individual's free choice, of which incentive to incorporate into their life's guiding principles, Kant gives us this foundational idea. our existence is defined by this fundamental self-constituting act.
And that makes things like self-deception
Or what the existentialists later called bad faith.
not just some psychological quirk, but a profound moral failure, a failure to live up to our own freedom.
Exactly. His entire project, in a way, becomes this monumental testament to practical reason, to the absolute necessity of moral commitment, even maybe especially in the absence of theoretical certainty.
And Kant himself warned, didn't he, that despair, giving up on that commitment, leads to this state of, well, indecision, passivity, where we just kind of drift and leave the core choices about who we are untouched.
He did. It's a state of moral stagnation.
So maybe the final thought for you, our listener, is this. Is self-deception, if bad faith, is fundamentally about avoiding the reality of our own absolute freedom and responsibility. What practical steps, maybe even small ones, can you take today, right now, to consciously affirm the responsibility that comes with your own willpower, your own power of choice?
It's a challenging question, because the choice, as Kant and the existentialists both suggest, isn't really whether to be free. That seems to be our inescapable condition as rational beings.
The real choice is how we use that freedom, how we choose to respond to that inescapable call of responsibility. That perhaps is the enduring ethical challenge left to us by both Kant and those who followed in his complex